Hey everybody, thank you for joining us. We are talking about Chapter 11 this week, and Chapter 11 is all about how to present your own research. Now, here's the thing, you're not actually collecting research this semester, so you're not really presenting research this semester, or at least not in Research Methods 1. You will have a chance to do that in Research Methods 2, but that's going to be a year from now, right? But this chapter is a nice way to kind of review and look at all the ways in which research is transmitted and disseminated to the public. So that's what we are talking about here. And I will be honest, actually, this video I think will be about 40 minutes, maybe a little bit shorter. And at the very end of it, we'll talk about the research proposal, the final paper part of this class. As I was putting these materials together, because I'm trying to sync up with the textbook, to kind of follow and cover the same material that the textbook is covering too. And the textbook is really like kind of talking about intro and methods and results and discussion, all these different sections of a research article. But here's the thing, you are already experts at that because you've already read, like 6, 7, or 8 of them? You've read a lot of them already for this semester, so some of this is going to be a bit of a review. So let's get into it. We're starting here by talking about research articles. Now, I know that you know this stuff already because, again, you've been reading these things this semester, but I want to take a quick step back, look at the big picture before we talk about how we, or why we have these pieces. And I guess maybe that's the angle I'm going to take for this video, is why are research articles like this? We are going to be following something called APA style. If you haven't heard of APA style before, that is okay, but it stands for the American Psychological Association. So we're looking at the American Psychological Association's format for writing, but it's not just, this is one of the things that I wish that my research methods instructor had told me about. Even though this is APA format, is not just for psychology. In fact, it's for a lot of different disciplines, and mostly science disciplines. Sociology uses APA style. EGST uses APA style. Biology uses APA style. It's just the style that a lot of the sciences use to write, and it's different than what you've learned probably in your other college classes, which is MLA style or Chicago style if you're a history major. So we're going to be talking all about APA style because as a psych major, you're going to be seeing this basically until you graduate and beyond. It's a big deal. So let's look at an APA style structure to a paper, which is what we see here. So we got the abstract. Now the abstract, some people really love the abstract. I don't really love the abstract because to me, I don't know, they're actually really hard for me to read, and I think it's because they're so zoomed out, they're so big picture, trying to summarize, 20-something pages in just, 250 words usually. But that's what it is. It is a summary, and it's meant to talk a little bit about the problem of the research, so what is the research question, talk a little bit about the methods, so how it was conducted, the results, what did they find, and then the discussion, which is how, what are the implications of it. And so the abstract is going to include kind of all 4 of these pieces, but these 4 pieces create really what we think of as the research article itself. So the introduction, this is the section where you talk about previous literature. You talk about what other research was done in the field, why is this research important, so maybe, connecting it to the real world and things like that, and citing, here's what other people did, and here's what they found, and here are the methods that they used. And you can also talk about why that stuff is important so that you can use that as a rationale for the present study. And that phrase, the present study, is usually what people mean whenever they are trying to say, here's what we're going to do in this article or in this study. They just say, here's what we're doing for the present study. Methods. So the methods, this is like a cookbook recipe. This is just going to be a bunch of facts so that if you were to pick up an article, you could know exactly what it would take to redo that article from scratch. You have all the pieces and all the elements, so you could follow that method section like a recipe and essentially replicate that experiment. So it's exhaustive. in that way. Now, and I can't remember if I mentioned this in one of the earliest videos for this class, but one of my favorite classroom activities in Research Methods 1, which we aren't able to do because we're online, one of my favorite examples is having people write down instructions to make a paper airplane. And the reason why is because if you were to think about how to make a paper airplane or how to tie your shoes or whatever, you would describe it very briefly because you know how to do it, you know that other people know how to do it. But if I'm just following your language, it's really easy to miss a step or to not explain something perfectly clear. So if I'm reading it, pretending like I'm a big dummy and doing these things wrong, your method section should be bulletproof. It should be exhaustive. It should have every single little detail so that anybody, even complete dummies out there, will be able to read it and understand it, or at least follow it and be able to replicate things with it. So that's the method section. The results section, and I saw a lot of feedback on the results section this semester from y'all in the discussion sections, don't really like the results, right? A lot of people talked about this as like the math part, and it is the math part. Whenever you take Psych 319 in the future, stats for psychologists, this is the section that you'll learn to understand. We're not going to worry about those details too much in this class, but we will talk a little bit about what some of those acronyms mean that you've been seeing before. So we'll talk about some of those pieces, but honestly, I think the results section is the last section that I read, because I think these others, because the stuff in the results section is usually so nitpicky that it's not even worth reading unless you're really trying to get clarification on something. And then we have the discussion section. So the discussion section is going to be the last part of the paper, and in my view, maybe the most important part of the entire paper. That's going to summarize the findings. Usually, the first paragraph in the discussion section is going to summarize the findings in perfect plain English, so that anybody can understand it, and you don't have to worry about jargon. You don't have to worry about math or anything like that. As the discussion section goes on, though, you'll see that it then goes on to include like real-world applications. So how are these findings useful for the common person? Has theoretical implications. Now that we know this piece of information, here's what it means about behavior and about how the mind works. It has limitations. So they'll even talk about, here are some of the limitations to the present study, which I don't know if you've noticed this as you've been reading the discussion sections on your own, that usually one of the final paragraphs will talk a little bit about, here are some of the limitations to the study. And again, I don't mean to go into too much of a tangent on this, but this is one of the things that I really love about science, and I really love about APA style, is that by emphasizing this section where it's like you have to talk about your limitations, I feel like in modern culture you don't talk about your limitations, right? That's seen as a weakness. You don't want to, and that's partly because of social media, right? We usually like to present our best selves forward. We like to, like if we're going on vacation, like take pictures of these beautiful places as if they represent our daily lives. We don't like to talk about limitations. But in science, it is okay to talk about limitations. In fact, it's good to talk about limitations. If your study has limitations, and it will because none of them are perfect, then the discussion section is where you will spend a little bit of time of saying, here are a couple of things that are reasons for us to be cautious about our results. Here are maybe some confounds here, or some order effects that might be affecting the data. It's okay to talk about those things. Yeah. And then we have the references section, and the references section is just going to be an exhaustive list of every single citation that you've done in that study, that you've done in your intro and your discussion. So anytime you reference something in the body of your paper, it'll have a reference at the very end, so that whoever's reading it can see that citation, go down to the bottom, and see exactly what the article was, what its title was, what the journal was, and they can find it themselves. Okay, so that is the structure of an APA article. But again, that's a little bit of a review. So why do we use APA style? A lot of students don't like APA style, and that is okay, because it's new to you. It is something that even if you learned it in senior year of high school because you were taking a psychology class or something like that, even if that was the case, you were learning other formats of writing before that. You were learning about MLA style before you learned about APA style. So a lot of people don't like APA style, but that's okay because I like APA style. I like it a lot because almost everything, there's an answer for every single thing that you might have questions about. Anything, so basically you can go online and you can find the answer for exactly how things are meant to be formatted. So there's no ambiguity, there's no vagueness about like what you should or shouldn't do. You know exactly what you should and shouldn't do because it's all kind of, out there. It's all formatted. It's carefully considered. So it is APA style. There is a book with all the rules on this that you can buy if you want to. Whenever I took research methods, it was required that I bought it, and I used the hell out of it. But that was because APA didn't have a whole lot of information on the internet because I'm old and it just wasn't one of those things that was really on the internet whenever I was in college. But it is now, so I didn't require that to be something that you bought for this class, and it's not something that I require my Research Methods 2 students to buy either, but there is a book that has basically every single thing you could know about how to cite research, or how to present research, or how to talk about your findings, or how to link to an outside source, and how to talk about conflicts of interest, everything. If you want to cite a podcast, then there's a way to do it. If you want to cite a movie, there's a way to do it. If you want to cite a conversation you had with someone over email, there is a specific way to do it. So, again, I don't require students to buy that because you can find it all online now. One great resource is this link that you can find right here in your slide notes. This is Purdue University. They have basically this online writing repository called the OWL. And so I shouldn't like that because we are the Owls. Dang it, we're Westfield. But Purdue, they are doing some yeoman's work with this because it's free and you can check it out and it will be helpful for you while you are writing your research proposal. And if you can't find it there, you can Google it, and I guarantee that somebody has asked that question before and has been answered already online. So there's a specific way to write about everything in APA format. And I think that's one of the reasons why students don't really like it, is because it is very nitpicky, but that is precisely the reason why I do like it. Alright, so this comes from our textbook, and it talks about the different values of APA style. So I just wanted to go through these very quickly. So, first one. There are very few direct quotations of other researchers. So whenever you are, usually you see this a lot in introductions of the section that's the introduction of a paper, where people will, when they're talking about other research, they'll just include what that other researcher said in their own writing, which is okay. But we want to minimize that as much as possible. We want to try to put things in your own words and not just have regurgitated or copy and pasted writing for that. Dr. Lynn Shelley, if you've had a class with her, her Research Methods 2 class, her rule is that you get one direct quotation, and then after that everything else has to be in your own words. So if you're talking about what somebody else did in their project, you can write about it, and you should cite them, but it shouldn't have to be word for word what they say. You don't need to do a direct quotation. Alright, so the second one, criticisms are directed at other researchers' work, but not at them personally. So if you're going to talk trash about an article and talk about its limitations or its weaknesses or how it got everything wrong, it's okay to talk about that work and how shoddy it is and how it's imperfect, but you should not talk about the researcher in those terms. You saw this already, right? You saw this already because there was one article that we read about portion sizes, and it was talking about the Cornell lab, right? And so it was talking about how the work from the lab was inconsistent, right? It didn't really talk about how the lab itself had some issues. Here there are many, and that keeps it so that it's not personal, because one of the goals of APA style is to remove the, I don't know how else to put this, to remove the humanity from it, to remove the subjectivity, to remove the bias that might possibly be in your writings. So you don't want it to be personal. You don't want it to be something that is emotionally charged. You want it to be as objective and as dry as possible so that you're not biased in the way you're writing about things. Next, there are many references and reference citations. Essentially, we want to back up everything that we say. Anytime you make a claim in a research article, you should have a citation for it. And that goes for everything. If I were to say something that was really obvious, for example, one of my research methods groups this semester, when they were writing about their research is about sleep, and they say, many college students have issues sleeping at night. And I circled it and I said, okay, you have to cite that. How do we know that? It might seem obvious, but we need some data to actually, believe it or to trust it. Because as we talked about this entire class, you can't just go off of one person's story. You can't just go off your gut feeling. It has to have something to back it up. I think about this kind of like if you're doing a math problem, it helps to show your work, right? Because that way, if you get the wrong answer, you can at least show whoever's grading your paper where you got that info, which is very, very valuable in research. Empirical research reports are organized with specific sections in a fixed order. We talked about that. That helps reduce the human element. That helps reduce the subjectivity. And then finally, researchers tend to hedge conclusions, such as the results suggest that. And this is just because, as scientists, we are always very, very skeptical. And we should know that just because we spent 2 years of our lives working on this research project and we found this finding doesn't mean that somebody 10 years from now might come redo our study and not find the same thing. It might be because our sample was very specific, or because there was something going on. Maybe it was just random chance that we found what we found. We have to hedge our conclusions. We have to be skeptical about our own work so that we're not overly biased in the way that we are presenting it. All right, so as I mentioned, most scientific writing is boring and dry, and the reason for that is to try to reduce the potential bias that can occur. And this is very different than how you are taught to write in most facets of your life, especially in college. When you take Comp 101, one of the big things that you're learning is how to be persuasive. And here you're trying to be persuasive, but oh man, this is hard to talk about. You want to be persuasive, but you don't want to appeal to emotion. You don't want to try to convince somebody on the merits of your personality, or of how good your writing is, or how persuasive your writing style is. Instead, what you want to use to be persuasive is your data. You want to show the reader, here's the data. And whenever you do it that way and you show them, like, here's what we found, here are the numbers that we got, then what's being persuasive isn't you, but it's your data and how you have organized that. So it's a fine line there, but that's the reason why it's boring and dry. Is because whenever you're writing, usually, whenever you're taking a Comp 101 class, is because you're learning about how to be an effective writing, an effective communicator, and how you can try to change people's hearts and minds, with your writing. Basically, for APA style, we want to change people's hearts and minds maybe, but we have to let the data speak for itself. And so for that reason, we're also going to avoid using first-person pronouns. So we're not going to say like we or I or anything else like that. We're just going to essentially try to talk about things as objectively as possible and not refer to kind of our own experience. So I'm not going to say like, we believe our data show. We shouldn't do that. We could say the data suggest or the data show a trend, but we can't, insert ourselves in there, or we shouldn't insert ourselves into there, because if I talk about, for example, how hard this data were to collect or what a challenge it was to do this stuff, that might influence the reader. Maybe they're looking at this and they're thinking like, oh man, I feel kind of bad for these people. This was a lot of work. I should believe it because they clearly went through a lot of work on this. So for that reason, we try to reduce first-person references, but we also try to reduce different things like adjectives. So talking about like, these compelling data or these terrible data or this great method or, things like that, because those things introduce bias. They try to be, they are intentionally persuasive, so we try to avoid using those. And same goes for using charged verbs. So you wouldn't want to say like, we struggled to come up with an explanation here, or we can't say like, our experiment was the first brave experiment that dared answer these questions. We don't want to use those for the exact same reason. We have to keep it boring and dry because we're trying to keep this as objective as possible. And the reason for that, and I guess I know I've talked about this too much, just to push this, drive this point home. Why is it so important that we remove the human element here? Because it shouldn't matter how good a writer you are if your data have something to say. If you did this study and you find something important, it should not matter if you are a bad writer. It should not matter if you are a good writer. And so, if you think about the opposite of that, if your data are bad, if your data are terrible and you didn't find anything good, you wouldn't want someone to believe your bad data because you are a good writer, right? That's not, why would you want that? So for that reason, we don't want writing skills necessarily to influence the reader, so that's why we try to keep things like adjectives and charged verbs out of it, which makes it very dry and kind of passive voice, but that's just kind of how it is. As you'll see in research methods too, there are effective ways to write in APA style too. Even if it is kind of boring, there's ways to make it readable and understandable and comprehensible, which is what we want, and not boring necessarily and wordy. We want things to be as concise as possible, which I know a lot of times students are blown away to hear this, because the things that you've read this semester, I don't think anybody would describe them as concise, right? Usually people talk about how boring and repetitive it is. But even so, researchers really try to reduce, to keep things as short as possible, to be as short and as clear as possible, to avoid wordiness, because it's not essential, it's not important for the article for it to be wordy. You should just get right to the point. So you wouldn't want to say something like, it has been said that, or based on the fact that. So it has been said that college students don't get much sleep at night, or based on the fact that college students, don't get much sleep at night. Those are too wordy. You should say, because college students don't go to sleep at night. And if you use something like Microsoft Word, right now Microsoft Word does this thing where it not only will it kind of check your spelling, but it also check for redundancies and things like that. So it might even try to give you tips on how to make your writing a little bit more concise, so that it is more clear. And again, you wouldn't want to say at the present time, you just want to say now, because it's less wordy. You wouldn't want to say the word actually or interestingly, and I learned this the hard way whenever I was taking research methods in college, and I was writing a paper about false memories. I was writing about false memories, and I was talking about how people they misremember things that actually didn't happen. And so I used the word actually a lot in this paper. And I remember when I got that paper back, there was just red ink all over it, because my professor, who I admire very much, and I would go on to work with him and have a good relationship with him, and did my thesis with him before going to grad school. But one of my first interactions with him, he handed me this paper. It had red ink all over it, and he says, "It's a good paper, but you don't need the word actually. You can take that out, and the sentence reads exactly the same." And I was a little bit embarrassed because I had used the word actually 50 times in this paper. But he was right, that I didn't need to say, these were things that actually happened. I could just say, these were things that happened, right? So just make sure, try to reduce things like that as much as possible. So when we're trying to find the right words to write about, there are a couple of really nitpicky things, which you may find on the quiz here. So, for example, if you're talking about differences between conditions or groups. If there are two groups, then you would say there are differences between those groups. If there's more than two groups, then you would say there are differences across those groups. Between is comparing directly, across is comparing in the big picture. That versus which, while versus since, these are other examples where they're not always interchangeable. If you're not sure which one is appropriate, you can always Google, am I using that versus which correctly? So you would say, like, that is the man that got my coffee, not that is the man which got my coffee. Which is an explanation of the first piece. So you would say, that is the man who got my coffee, which went on to burn my tongue. Right? Because that which is referring to the coffee, not the man. You get it. You've taken a grammar class before. You know how these things work. Another thing, whenever you're talking about data, data is actually plural. If you're talking about one piece of data, that is called a datum, which is, I don't know, it doesn't really sound very nice, right? I feel like datum does not sound very good. Data sounds fun, but that's only when it's plural. So if you're talking about one specific person, then you're talking about one datum. If you're talking about quantities, fewer is regarding items and less is regarding something that can't be discretely counted. So if you're talking about something that you can hold and put in your hands and count, then that is fewer. If you're talking about something that you would measure, like how much water is in a bottle, that would be less. So the proper grammar would be, like, at the checkout line, it would be 12 items or fewer, not 12 items or less. But you could say, I got served less Coca-Cola than my brother did, because Coca-Cola is varying in measurements but not in actual quantity. Another common thing is affect versus affect. So, and I see this used a lot, or these mistakes a lot. The difference, or the starting vowel, is it an E or an A? Which one should you use if you're using this as a noun? So my words had an effect on you. That would be using an E, because that is a noun. If I was saying my words affected you, that is a verb, and that makes it an A. So the way that I remember this is because I learned this mnemonic that, like, if that affect is a verb. If the static is affecting my hearing, that is a verb, so it would be an A. The way that I remember that it's an A is because it's a verb, and verbs are for actions, and so that's how I know that it is an A. I don't know if that'll help you remember it that way, but that's how it helped me remember it that way. The thing that I said in most circumstances is because we are psychologists, we will be talking about emotions, and so sometimes you might have different emotional states, and those are called affects. So, for example, if someone has schizophrenia, one of the common symptoms of that is what's called a flat affect, which is where they don't really have outwardly emotional responses. Or if I said, oh, you had a negative affect on your face, that means that you have a grumpy look on your face. You have a negative look on your face. If we're citing authors, you can do that in a couple of different ways, but one of them is like this, where at the end of a sentence you include them in a parenthesis, or parenthetical statement. So you could say, working memory is the ability to temporarily encode and store information from the environment. So that definition is a paraphrase of what these authors said in their 1974 chapter. So as I mentioned, scientists show their work by doing this. If I'm talking about working memory, then I am showing my work and saying, like, look, this isn't just I didn't pull this definition out of my butt. This definition comes from this article. And if you have an argument with that, then you can take it up with these guys in the 70s. You shouldn't take it out on me. It's well established, and we know that because it was originally done in the 70s. So that way it tells everybody exactly what definition you're referring to, but also whenever you're using things like talking about methods and stimulus and scales and inventories and things like that, having these citations lets the reader know exactly where they can find more detail about those things, so that if they are doing it themselves, they know exactly where it is. And also, and this is one of those things that, I am not going to be picky about in this class, but I will be picky about if I see you in Research Methods 2, which I hope that I do see you in Research Methods 2. It's one of my favorite classes to teach. You don't have to say, In a study by Baddeley and Hitch, they found that working memory. You don't have to say that. And the reason why is because if you're putting something in a paraconthetical statement right here, we know that you're doing that because you're referring to a study by Baddeley and Hitch. We don't need that extra info because it's implied. So you could just say, Baddeley and Hitch found that working memory is the ability, if you wanted to. You don't have to say in a study because we know it's in a study. We know that because you have the citation, and so we can look down at the references and we'll find that it is a study. I'm not going to spend... Well, okay, I will spend some time on this because I think it will help you whenever you're doing your research proposal. I think that the introduction is probably the hardest part of a paper to write. And the reason for that is because almost anything can go in your intro, right? If you're talking about your methods, which I think is your methods are the easiest section to write, you already know what's going to be there because you've done it or you're going to do that research. So you already know everything that should be there. For your results, very much the same. You know what questions you're going to be answering, so you just have to answer them using math and stats. For your intro, you have to essentially say, here are the important articles that I want to talk about. Here are the problems that I want to focus on. Here are the other articles out there that I want to mention and highlight and why they are important. And that's going to vary from person to person. Whenever I teach research methods, and this will be the last time I talk about research methods too, because I'm talking about it too much in this video. Whenever I teach that class, we do group work. We do research in groups. So it's usually 15 students in a class, and so I split that into 5. So 5 groups of 3. And everybody in that group will have the same methods and results for the most part. But they vary wildly depending on their intro and discussion, because you can write about whatever you want and you can tackle it however you like. And so that can make it hard to write, right? So whenever you are writing that for your proposal, whenever you're approaching this angle, think about what is the behavior that you're interested in. So tell us what that behavior is, define it, talk about how it's measured, tell us about how it applies to the real world, and then tell us what more we should know about it. And so your literature review here is going to give you a couple of paragraphs where you're talking about previous research, usually a couple of really classic articles that kind of establish this stuff, and then maybe some more recent things, some cutting edge things. And so by talking about those things, what you're doing is you're talking about, here's these other articles and here's why they are important. And while you're doing that, while you're emphasizing why those things are important, you're also making a case for your own study and this is what I meant about how you can be persuasive without being persuasive. That by explaining, here's why these articles are important, here's why their data are interesting, what you're doing is that you're then going to have the reader more interested in your own work because you're explaining why your work is important, because you're explaining why the work that came before it is important. And then you'll finally close with your hypothesis here. So your final paragraph of that should essentially be, here is your direct hypothesis, and here's how you're going to go about to measure it. Stats, we're going to talk a lot about stats in the next couple of chapters, so I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but there is a standardized way of reporting stats. So you have seen some of this stuff already, that whenever people talk about a capital N, they're referring to the total number of participants in a sample. Whenever they use an uppercase M, they're referring to the mean or the average of the data. The SD is the standard deviation, which is a measurement of variability. The degrees of freedom is a measurement that is used in statistical tests. The R is the Pearson correlation coefficient, and there are different letters that stand in for different tests. And so you'll learn about that again in next semester when you take stats for psychologists. But also you'll learn a little bit more about it in next chapter when we talk about different kinds of stats. So here is an example. This is one of those things that you would have seen in a research article that we've read, and it looks like gibberish. So here's how to read this. So here's an example. The experimental drug had no effect on memory retention. Participants in the control condition did not remember fewer words than participants in the drug condition. So I just skipped over all the numbers for now, right? I skipped over all that. let's go back and look at those numbers and what they mean. So participants in the control condition, n equals 11. So this tells us how many people were in the control condition. Did not remember fewer words, and then we'd say, here's how much they remembered. On average, the control condition remembered 7.3 words with an average of about 1, give or take. So some of them may have had 6.3, some of them may have had 8.3, but for the most part, the mean was about, or the average was about 7.3. Then participants in the drug condition, sample is 13, so there were 13 people in that, and then we see their average and their standard deviation. And if we look up here for these, which are, maybe these are a little bit more confusing, but this is referring to which test was used. This is referring to the degrees of freedom. This is referring to the test value. This is referring to the p-value, and that is what the observed p-value is. All that stuff you'll learn about next semester. Or you may have learned about in elementary stats. I'm not sure if you took that as part of your core. You may already know about it. There are a couple of other forms. We're getting close to the end here. There are other forms of communication that we can talk about because you'll come across them before you graduate, and they are oral presentations. And so this research communication, almost all of the great research is done in research articles. Occasionally, though, you'll see people citing presentations and posters and things like that. And as a student, you'll probably be engaging in at least one of these before you graduate. So sometimes research can be transmitted through an oral presentation. These are usually about 15 minutes or so. Sometimes they can be as short as 10 minutes, or sometimes they can be as long as an hour, although that is pretty rare. Usually if you go to a conference, talks are going to be about 15 minutes. Whenever I went to the Eastern Psychological Association's conference this past spring, my talk was 15 minutes, and that's pretty normal. And in those 15 minutes, you're going to quickly summarize the experiment and talk about the methods. So and talk about the results. So you're basically going to kind of outline what you would have covered in a research paper. You're just doing it in a visual medium, which is kind of, it's kind of like a little lecture. It's a 15-minute lecture where you're talking about that article. And then we also have poster presentations, which are also very popular, and you can see these actually here on campus. If you go at the end of the semester, we always have something at the Celebration for Undergraduate Research of Creative the Celebration for Undergraduate Research and Creative Activities on campus. And basically every semester we have this where students submit their work, whether it be research or creative in nature, and they talk about it. And usually it's as a poster, which is a 3-foot by 4-foot slide or template, where you're going to summarize the findings all in that one slide. So you get to stand in front of your poster, and it's this really cool experience where essentially you just stand there and people will come by, and then you say, hey, you want me to tell you about my poster? And they'll say, no, that looks boring, and they'll walk on. Or they may say, ooh, yeah, actually I am interested in this. Tell me about it. And so for about 5 minutes, you'll just kind of talk with them and run them through the visuals of it. And so here's an example of this. This is something that I did with another student previously. I'm including his name. He just graduated. I'm including his name on here because I'm proud of it, and I think he's probably proud of it too. So I should probably ask his permission, right? So in this, we would go on to write a full manuscript of this and submit it for publication in a research journal. But this has pretty much everything a paper would cover, where we talk about the introduction. So we're talking about, here are, the important other research studies that were done out here. Here's what our hypotheses are. Here's our methods, and here's some of the stimuli that we used. Here's a little bit about how those trials were constructed, and then we talk about the results. So we give them these figures, and we try to make it visually dynamic. And so whenever Nate was presenting this at a conference, he could just stand in front of this poster and then say, like, all right, here's what we did, and you could run somebody through this, and then if they have questions, then they can stop you and they can ask you about it. Really cool experience. If you get a chance, I would definitely recommend trying to do a poster before you graduate, because, and this is a story for another time maybe, but the first poster that I ever presented was at this really small conference at my own university, kind of like Kirka, and my parents came to see it, and my dad, it was actually a big turning point in his relationship with me, where I think at that point he kind of realized, oh, this is what my son wants to do with his life, and he's really good at it, and he's really interested in it, and now I understand why he's interested in it. And so, you may not think that you're a research person. I didn't think that I was either until I kind of got my hands dirty with it and presented some myself. So if you get a chance to present on a poster, definitely, give it a shot. And then there are a couple of other other ways that research can be communicated. There are review articles, which are also published in peer review, just like journal articles are. They're published in journals, and instead of presenting new data, these review articles go out and they essentially try to find every article relevant to a research question, and they kind of look at the broad trends of it. Sometimes that means that people are going to do analyses on that body of literature they find, and that's called a meta-analysis. So this would be like, hey, I surveyed 100 studies that looked at the link between social media use and anxiety, and we found that 56 of them showed a negative correlation, and then 30 of them found no correlation, and then 13 or 14, however many are left out of 100, found a positive correlation, right? So basically they're kind of analyzing that and then giving you some kind of stats about the broad conclusions there. Theoretical articles, I honestly don't think you have to worry too much about at an undergraduate level. I could be wrong about that, but usually these are kind of high-level articles that you also find published in journals, and they are these like cutting-edge articles that are proposing new theories about why we do the things that we do, or how our mind works, or how our brain operates, and outlines these new hypotheses that can be tested. And so usually these are important articles that may not have data, but have some really compelling ideas. All right, so finally we're at the end here. We're talking about research proposals. So if you are designing a research proposal, you can check the rubric online, for kind of some expectations for what pieces should have what. But what research proposals are used for? If I want to do some research, I need funding to do that. And so if I'm requesting funding, whether that be from Westfield or from the state of Massachusetts or from the National Institute of Health or the National Science Foundation or whatever, I have to make a proposal for it. I need to say, here is why this study is important, and here's how I can do it. So I need to emphasize what is the importance of the study on hand and what is the feasibility of the study. And feasibility can be broken down into what is the cost, but the cost is referring not just to money, but also what does it cost in time and what does it cost in labor. Is this something that is feasible, that could be done in the timeline that you have suggested? So whenever you're designing this, usually you're going to have kind of broadly speaking, you have kind of three sections here. You're going to have an introduction where you're going to be talking about what the research question is. So you'll want to define what the research concept is. So if you're talking about depression, define what depression is. Tell us why it's important. What other research out there has been done on depression? What is your question about depression? Then you would transition into your methods after you have established what that research question is. Then you can outline, or I should say, after you've defined what your hypothesis is, then you move on to the methods, and there you're going to just kind of walk through step by step. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to have 100 trials, and we're going to have 50 of those trials be, we're going to show people a cute animal, and then 50 trials we're going to show them a chair or something that's not, interesting or emotional. And here's where we are going to get those images, and here's how long they look at those images, and here's how long the delay is between those images, and they're going to look at it on a computer about this screen size, and so on and so forth. As specific as you can be. And then finally, you'll have expectations. So what did you expect to find here? So here you can also include figures. You can say, here's the trend I expect to find, and you have like a scatter plot, or you have a bar graph showing what you would expect to find based on your hypotheses. And then you also want to include your references. And so that is pretty much it for this. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, thank you for tuning in. And now that you've made it to the end, I don't have any dogs in here, as you can see, unfortunately. So I tried to think, what could I show you? So I'm going to try to show you something. This is Teddy whenever he was just a puppy. And so this picture of Teddy was, I think we had him for a week, maybe a couple of weeks or something like that, but that is how small he was at that age. And I can show you what he looks like now. Looks like this grizzled old man from the snow, and he's got some gray in his snout now, but you can kind of see what he looks like now and kind of how big he is. You know, he's this kind of big looking dog, and you can see my dog's here hanging out, barking at random stuff, digging in the snow. So this is your treat for staying until the end. Thank you so much for watching until the end of the lecture video. Alright, good night. Bye everybody.